Dean, thank you. Well, new tonight, Snapchat is now banning President Trump, the latest in a line of suspensions and bans from the likes of YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram and Twitter. The move igniting a debate again over social media. Today, I spoke with people on both sides of the issue. First, MIT media professor Ethan Zuckerman, who says social media sites are indeed within their right as private companies to ban users who do not follow their policies. So much news the last few days. Obviously, what Twitter and other social media platforms did in terms of banning President Trump was one of those major headlines. What was your top line reaction when you heard what they had done? Why do you think it was the right step?
I think it was the right step because the president was actively encouraging people towards violence. It was hard to read the videos that he'd posted on Twitter and Facebook as anything other than essentially excusing the violence at the Capitol and encouraging his followers to keep fighting. And I think in a situation like that, fighting words, shouting fire in a crowded theater, it makes sense to remove someone from that tool of speech. That said, more broadly, I'm not thrilled about this idea of how much control Facebook and Twitter have of anyone's speech, and I'm not sure that we should be all that thrilled either.
And when you talk about control, they literally, these companies, had the ability to silence the leader of the free world. Regardless of your opinions on the good or bad of what he said, as you just alluded to, it does speak to their power. Is this a situation where they have too much power? And if you think so, then what can be done? Can the government step in? How do you remedy something that is this big and this powerful?
Let's be clear about silencing, right? This is still someone who has a press secretary. This is still someone who has a massive staff. The world's attention is on him. He has a weekly radio address. He has a lot of ways to get a message out. This is not someone who's going to be writing letters in a bottle and throwing them in the Potomac. What's happened is that a channel of communication that the president particularly likes and particularly uses to express anger has been cut off. This is not a First Amendment issue. The government didn't make any decision here. Twitter is a private company. They have rules of the road, and those rules of the road expressly prohibit incitement to violence. And President Trump had been warned many, many times. So I don't think the platforms are in the wrong. I do think in the long run, it's probably not a great idea to give the public sphere of our time and put it under the control of these individual platforms. There's other ways we could build this public sphere so that people had control over the platforms that they're using. And I'm hoping that part of what happens with President Trump's deplatforming is that we have a conversation that isn't about when the platforms kick people off, isn't necessarily about government regulation, might be about whether we build social media in a way that our communities end up governing them and deciding what's acceptable speech.
I also spoke with a UCLA law professor about the social media deplatforming of President Trump, and he told me that he does think private companies like Twitter have a right to ban users, but that banning an elected official with such a large following may be an excessive use of that power. When you look at the content that President Trump put online, do you feel it violated some kind of norm that incited or potentially incited violence? Meaning, do you think Twitter has a case here?
Twitter concluded that it violates its policies. Maybe it does. And then it will be an interesting question whether other kinds of speech from people in other movements also violate their policies, and maybe some of the time they block them too. So I'm not saying that Twitter violated its own policies. It's hard to tell because, of course, the process is not transparent. It's not like with the courts where you have all these court records you can look to see how the courts are operating. But it's possible that what they're doing is quite consistent with their own policies. The question is whether we want to have these immensely powerful and wealthy corporations influencing public discourse at that level. And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe they're an important corrective to possible misbehavior by either high-level elected officials or leaders of other movements or whatever else. Maybe. But also you might worry that you don't want to have a situation where the decision whether an elected official or a candidate for office or the leader of some religious or ideological movement, whether he can effectively talk to his supporters, is controlled by this business and by the few rich and powerful people who run it.
What Twitter did a few days ago certainly enhanced the parlors of the world and made them a little more appealing. So there is a danger to closing off one road, because then folks find some other roads where the conversation can potentially get darker because it is less monitored.
I think part of the problem is when you tell basically what he had about, I think the president had about 80 million followers on Twitter. When you tell those people, look, we don't like the person you're following, we're going to block it. And this new platform, Parler, that some of you, not all of you by any means, but many of you are interested in, we're going to block it too. I think that makes people feel aggrieved. That makes people feel that they are being shunned. Their speech is being squelched, and they're more likely to then, as a result, become alienated from the system. And then a fraction, a tiny fraction to be sure, but a fraction of them are more likely to act violently as well. I mean, this has been a common argument in the past, often when there have been attempts to suppress speakers on the left, saying, oh, you think you're shutting up kind of bad, dangerous, pro-communist or pro-revolutionary voices, but what you're doing is you're just driving them underground and making people feel more aggrieved, removing the safety valve of public expression and thus perhaps increasing the risk of violence. Well, that's a concern that I think is true whether you're worried about the left or about the right.
Now, both men I interviewed, while falling on different sides of the debate, still are seemingly in agreement on wondering if social media companies these days simply have too much power, too much influence in public discourse in America. They also agree that what Twitter did was not in violation of the First Amendment because it is a private company like the others that have taken steps to ban the president. Meantime, speaking of Mr. Trump, he did release another White House video tonight, as we mentioned, condemning the social media bans, calling them an assault on free speech. He said Americans should listen to each other and not silence each other.